Ready to go, guys. Thanks. Hi, thanks for joining this afternoon, and welcome to our latest Tales and Tech webinar. I'm Luke. I'm a director here at Burn Sheehan, and today we're joined by Elliott Thwaites. He's the former head of technology at GVC Group. He'll be giving us a talk today on sustainable cloud practices. We do have questions. If you do have questions at the end, and you think of any during the talk, there's a Q&A function here provided at the bottom. So I'll let you crack on. Introduce yourself.
Thanks very much, Luke. I'm just going to quickly share my screen. Hopefully everybody can see that nice and clearly now. So yes, if I could use my mouse, that'd be good. Thanks very much, Luke, for the introduction. At heart, I'm a problem solver. I'm a technology enthusiast. I still remember the day that I kind of unwrapped a present from my mum, which was a 56.6K modem. And I remember getting fired up on the internet. And ever since then, for me, it's been kind of a journey of discovery. And obviously, you know, with the way that things have recently gone in the entirety of technology, the cloud has massively expanded as this kind of concept that everyone gets attracted to. And the thing that I'm here to talk to you about today is really that, you know, it's an amazing resource, but it needs to be harnessed in the correct way. I am very much a realist. You know, there are, you know, tens of theories about how you should use the cloud, you know, tens of theories about development methodologies. You know, when it comes to agile, for example, the debate will always be there, but I'm very much a realist in that respect. And I know that there's no kind of one size fits all for everyone. So please don't, you know, think that I'm going to tell you how exactly to do things. I'm just going to provide a bit of a guide from my experience in the best way to do such things. As I said, the cloud is an amazing resource, but it does need to be harnessed in the correct way. And there are many pieces of literature that you could look at that would tell you exactly how to do things, you know, from the public cloud providers themselves, or maybe you're going down your own route of hosting a private cloud and you've read some resources of how to do that. There is no kind of by the book way to do these things. The most important thing, in my opinion, in terms of building sustainably in the public cloud specifically, is going to be building a culture. And this is where we'll start to touch on some of the aspects around DevOps and SRE and security ops, etc. But for me, you know, harnessing the power of such an amazing resource such as the cloud, it fundamentally comes down to culture. You know, when you first get started on AWS, for example, you can look at the console and you look at the range of services that are available to you. And if you let your organization, whether you're a developer yourself or, you know, a leader or any kind of role within a technology organization, you know, you'll be so excited. You're a kid with all the toys that you can possibly imagine. And using those in a responsible and sustainable way, it really comes down to how you organize your use of those things. And look, there are thousands of use cases to be able to do that. And we don't want to stop people from being able to innovate and discover how to use those things, but we do. And I promise you, from my own personal experience, you do want to do this is build in a very sustainable way that keeps you fit for the future and keeps you being able to unlock that innovative side of the public cloud before, you know, you end up going down a route where you've got an absolute mess to solve. And we'll touch on some of the ways you can do those things within your organization, how you can organize your people and your processes to be able to do that. So what's in store? Look, I don't want to death by PowerPoint you. I'm going to talk quite openly and quite fluidly. I'm going to talk about how you best start out or fix it now if you're already in quite an established organization and, you know, you want to know how to fix things if they feel a little bit messy in your head. How to organize your organization, reliability, really, you know, drawing back to building things in a reliable and stable way is going to be one of the key things to how you can build sustainably in the cloud over time. Cost control, I mean, it's the big thing on everyone's lips when it comes to cloud. How much is it going to cost? You know, when you're talking to your senior leaders, they're going to ask you about these financial questions and how you can, you know, match or better what you might be already paying for in physical data centers, for example. Constructing your framework of freedom, and this will wrap up nicely around the kind of cultural elements of what I've been mentioning. So starting out, I mean, now is the time to get it right. If you are working in a startup environment or you're thinking about, you know, even as an individual deploying your own cloud application and building that into something which you see growing and growing, now is the best time to start fostering what I will call the technology culture. You know, if you build solidly from the base, you know, your success will be much smoother and much more sustainable as you go along. You know, it sounds very obvious to say this, but you know, I can imagine being in a startup environment. Personally, I've never been in a startup environment myself, but I still think this is very relevant to new projects in established organizations which may be considering the cloud as a way forward. This is the time, before you start doing your development work, before you start building your infrastructure out in the cloud, before you start doing all of the associated configurations. Now is the time to start to think about that culture. How are you going to bring the rest of your organization, whether you are you know, a person with many hats on as an individual, or you know, a group of people that are building something. You've got to get these things right before you go too fast. Over acceleration will have consequences, and making sure that you get these things right from the very, very start is so important. So do take the time to think about how you're going to build sustainably based on the things that I'll talk about going ahead in this project. Think about the issues you might run into later on down the line when you become an established enterprise, because if you don't get those things right now, you're going to end up in likely a gigantic mess that you will have to eventually solve anyway, and nobody wants that. And sometimes, and this is a really important point as well, sometimes the best way to use the cloud is not to use it. And what I mean by that is, you know, especially in established enterprises that have traditionally come from, you know, physical data center background, or maybe have already got a kind of hybrid setup. You know, sometimes the best thing to do with a new project is not to go to the cloud. Not all workloads are suitable for the cloud. If you're already established in a public cloud provider, you might just be tempted to throw your infrastructure in there just because it's the done thing. Just think about it. I urge people to think about what they're doing, because if you end up doing something with a workload that's not suitable for the cloud, you know, the kind of traditional highly sort of stable repetitive workloads that might not just gain the cost effectiveness and innovative techniques that you can achieve using the cloud, it might just be best to go to an on-prem service and create a hybrid, or even create a hybrid infrastructure. If you do something in the cloud as a start in a startup organization, and it goes wrong, whether it be through technical reasons or through financial reasons, and those things could have been rectified by going to on-premise straight away, then you're just going to end up with your senior leaders saying to you, right, we should have just done this from the start. And then cloud all of a sudden becomes this thing that you don't want to go to. And obviously you want to keep that kind of open and honest culture within, you know, the communication between software engineering and senior leaders as well. So doing the right thing from the start, I promise you will certainly help you achieve those things. So what if you're already in an established organization? Perhaps you're already in the cloud. Perhaps you've got a hybrid setup. I know from my own experience and through, you know, talking to a lot of people in my network, that sometimes their organization and their technology stack and setup can feel a little bit like this. You might have 4 or 5 projects with many actors involved, you know, whether they be technology actors or external or senior leaders or project management, et cetera, all trying to get their interests poked into these projects and making sure that, you know, things are running smoothly, and it ends up just becoming a bit of a mess in your head or even tangibly within the organization. As I say, fixing it now, there is no time like the present. If it feels like that to you, that's not the end of the world. Every situation is recoverable in some way, shape or form. It might not be that you can get the perfect ending, but things might start to feel a little bit better in your head when you're thinking about how your organization is set up and how your technology is set up. However, you will need to be willing to focus time and probably sort of redirect some of your people and their focuses to be able to fix this. And this will be a challenge with senior leadership. And, you know, I'll go on to talk about how you can achieve some of those things with bringing your senior leadership along on the journey. If you haven't got an amazing CTO who knows everything that he or she is doing and wants to sponsor this, you know, sometimes it can be a little bit difficult. And I think that one of the big things that people need to recognize is that change around implementations in the public cloud or even otherwise, you know, it doesn't need to be specifically around your cloud workloads and projects that are involved in the public cloud. You do have to bring people from very, very different realms of your organization along with the journey. And this comes back to the cultural element, right? people often in organizations where you've got a software engineering outfit will probably expect that outfit to be the one that instigates and fulfills all of this change. You know, I've worked in organizations where that certainly has been the kind of opinion, and unfortunately, because of the people who sponsor the time that the software engineers are using, they're always focused on product development and product releases, etc. You know, there's always the famous debate around tech debt and how much space that should take up in a sprint, for example. But this is something a little bit more than technical rectification. This is something about how to build things sustainably in the longer term. This isn't, you know, what we delivered on a 2-week or a 4-week basis. And for that reason, you know, I've called out on this slide, you know, that project management, business analysis, technical analysis, architecture, QA are all things that should be involved. And actually, one thing that I haven't called out on the slide that's very important to note, actually involving, you know, recruitment in that process as well. You know, I've seen many CVs and resumes with, you know, tons and tons of languages, operating systems, certifications, etc. galore. But really, when it comes down to it, you're looking for a certain type of person to come into an organization to help start that change. And that's not just senior leaders, that's not just your heads of, that's also, you know, right down to your junior DevOps engineers or your junior developers. You know, these sorts of people can start to foster that change if they've got the right attitude towards doing things, and they're allowed to sort of live and breathe that attitude when they come to work, and they're not suffocated from it, which I'll come on to in the kind of the framework of creative freedom. But it's really important to kind of bring those other roles that aren't necessarily traditional technology roles along the journey with you. So project management, for example, I've worked with some fantastic project managers, but the best thing that they did to become a fantastic project manager was to take a little bit of time out of their day to learn about what the cloud is and how it functions, and understand the kind of challenges that kind of went with that for developers or software engineers, QA engineers, etc., that were new to it. You know, we live in a world where virtualization is probably accepted as a standard and a norm, but public cloud and how those things work, particularly the nuances between AWS and GCP and Azure, etc., even Oracle, you know, these things aren't necessarily widely known, and education is really key for that. And there's some really simple things that you can do to bring those people along the journey with you. You know, there are many resources that are available online from the public cloud providers themselves. There are webinars like this one and many others that will help people to understand what the best practices and what you're trying to achieve in the cloud really is. And obviously, you know, not just kind of from a DevOps engineering perspective, but the technical roles such as architects and QAs, etc. Great for them to be as inputs and outputs in a traditional software engineering cycle, I suppose. If you get it right in terms of those inputs and design is correct from the start, and having those people clued up on how these things are going to manifest themselves in terms of physical infrastructure, really important to have those people on the journey as well. And one of the big things I think is to be very conscious of, you know, previous mistakes. So not being afraid to actually cast a light on these things is really important as well. If you're in a large organization and you start to spot these mistakes, be open and honest about it, because it will only cause you more pain in the future if you do not highlight those things. You know, and getting those things right and starting to fix those tangible things and rising them up to the top of the tree in terms of priority is super important. And doing things like those kind of boring audits, it's not going to be a boring exercise whatsoever if you're involving people that want to learn and want to be a part of that culture in terms of how to build more sustainably going forward in the future. Navigating disorganization, the picture before with the nuts and bolts and screws all over the place. I've certainly worked in places where it feels like that, and many organizations that I've come across, whether my own experience or talking to others, are incredibly disorganized and are completely the opposite of what you expect from something that calls itself an organization. What I have previously advocated in previous roles is creating cultural units to remedy this. As I say, you know, it's not purely down to people, and it's not purely down to process. One of the key things that I did in the previous role, we fostered this SRE and DevOps organization, which grew and grew. I started off with 3 people at the start in an SRE function, which were largely focused on finding the issues and kind of doing those kind of audits, as it were. But then we fostered the culture of DevOps, and it's not just people. You know, when I exited that organization, we still had, you know, around 15 to 20 at any one time, SRE and DevOps engineers. But the goal was to actually sort of make that team not a team anymore, and have those people embedded within those sort of software engineering, traditional development organizations, so that it just became a way of life. And people also talk about cloud framework. You know, in the example of AWS, you've got the well-architected framework. It's not just a process, right? And you know, the well-architected framework is a fantastic document and a fantastic way to start to think about how you should build things in the cloud, but it's certainly not just a process. And again, an example from my own experience was we had you know, a bunch of people that were working in a specific cloud framework team, and their job was to remedy some of the issues that had manifested themselves through a lack of awareness of how to build sustainably. And if you're a leader, or if you're you know, somebody that reports into a leader in an organization, big or small, I would strongly urge you to push this kind of idea of SRE, DevOps, and cloud framework, because the power that you can achieve through having a mixture of people and processes is second to none if you do it right. And having the time often means that you're going to need people that are dedicated to doing this. Unfortunately, if you work in a big organization, if you don't have someone that's kind of spearheading this from a leadership perspective and a team perspective, it will be quite difficult to achieve some of the results that you expect. So if you're thinking now, when you're listening to me talking, that, you know, there are problems where you do think that things are a mess, and you can see this kind of big crash coming down the line and a real challenge coming down the line that you want to avoid, I would strongly recommend pushing for having some people that are dedicated to thinking about how to remedy this situation, and giving that time within you know, their own workflows and their own spaces. It doesn't need to be new people, it can be existing people, but just putting some people on point for thinking about those things is something that will be really positive. And whoever is doing that, look, there are, you know, I worked in an organization where there were, you know, up to 10, 15 major projects rolling on simultaneously, each with their own dedicated software engineering functions, often software engineering functions that were split between 2 projects or even more at any one time. And they're going to have a set way of operating, you know, whether it's about how they organize their teams in terms of numbers of engineers to QAs, etc., or how they do development, if they're doing agile or safe or waterfall, or even, you know, what languages they're using and what tools they're using. They're going to have their own set ways, and it's going to be very hard for you to positively influence their approach to public cloud if you try to disrupt them too much and try to tread on toes, as I've put it here in the slide. Positive disruption is always the best way. Critical conversations are always the best way. Being open and honest, that when it came to implementing some of the strategies that we wanted to implement to save money, to build more reliably, did we have tough conversations between people? Yes, we 100% did. But were they always in the spirit of honesty and positivity? Yes. So again, fostering that culture of being open and honest is really key. And again, that comes down to the people that you have in your organization. When it came to hiring people, I wouldn't want someone working in my team that was very closed off and very set in their ways. People that want to learn and are able to have conversations and be self-critical, and also take criticism on board from other people, and have those kind of interpersonal skills to be able to do so. Really key for getting things right. As I said, the cloud is an amazing resource, and if you let someone who knows what they're doing technically do what they want in it, then it might not be the best thing for your organization long term in terms of expenditure and technical setup. You know, there are an incredible amount of quick wins in the cloud. And, you know, letting someone, as I kind of put it earlier, have all the access to all of the toys in the box, they will go and play with every single one of them, and that could be, you know, detrimental in the long term. So having those conversations is really important, and they come in the form of retrospectives, you know, in the traditional agile methodology, but it doesn't need to be just that. It could just be face-to-face interaction. I know face-to-face interaction is hard to come by these days, you know, even now we're on Zoom, but, you know, having those really, you know, short, sharp conversations, right? Should we do it this way? Should we do it that way? Maybe they need to be extended. Maybe they need to bring in more members of the team. Just do it. And hopefully you know, you're starting to feel like, you know, there will be a way that you can start to feel like this. And I don't expect this picture to ever be achieved in anyone's minds, but if we can start to work towards that, then that'd be excellent. If you don't have a risk register, I strongly encourage you to create one, because it will just help to organize things in your mind, you know, where these things are within the cloud specifically, or perhaps part of a hybrid infrastructure, or even if you're not building in the public cloud at all and you're thinking about virtualization in your own data centers, I strongly recommend it. And then doing something about it is really important. So taking the time to kind of factor these things into software engineering cycles, or if you've got a DevOps engineering team, or if you've got someone that's got expertise in kind of deployment methodologies and infrastructure building and networking, etc., make sure these people are given a mandate to go and do something about it. Look, and the rest of it, you know, use backups and failovers, have them in place, but please test them. Make sure that you know you can run on them. One of the big things that I kind of always think is operational excellence is it always seems to be a number at the end of the day, which is your availability and uptime metric. I honestly don't think that operational excellence is solely that. I think that in technology, we have to be honest that things do always go wrong. And they always will, no matter what. You'll never have the perfect scenario. And operational excellence to me is being able to deal with those things well when they do go wrong. And you can have all of the implementations under the sun. You can have your failover mechanisms in place. You can be running on Kubernetes. You can have all of your tools that tell you they're going to be self-healing, and have every single, you know, Lambda function kick off to do something to rectify an issue when it finds it. But I think that when it comes down to it, there is still a really big element of people that work in operations that do have to react to these things. And if you know how to do those things and you have good documentation to back it up, if you give these people the right education about how the cloud works, and they understand who to mobilize and what tools to mobilize at any one time during an incident, you'll be on the way to operational excellence. Achieving perfection is not an attainable goal. Striving your best to do it involves having those kind of processes in place where you do have a comfort that when things go wrong, things will get better quickly. And one of the big things that I also think contributes heavily to reliability is making your teams accountable, and that can come in a few forms. You know, people will talk about, well, when we have an issue, we get that software engineering team or those developers or that DevOps engineer that's worked on it to be accountable for it, so that he or she will have done a great job beforehand. 100% agree. You know, if you give people the responsibility of having to deal with production issues, then of course they'll strive naturally, as all humans would, to do a good job to avoid being called out at midnight on a Friday night or whatever it is. But one of the big things that, you know, I will always strive to achieve is making data visible to the teams in a day-to-day. Very, very difficult sometimes, depending on what you're working on, to feel that you're working on a living and breathing system. So it's you become almost very disconnected with the product you're working on. But having dashboards and having both technology and product, very importantly, product metrics available on screens around the office space, or, you know, in this current situation we find ourselves in, if there's a quick link that you can build to a plethora of dashboards with quick insights into how things are going, both from a technical and, very importantly, a product space, it will keep the system alive for you and, you know, your colleagues in their minds. If you can see that people are using it, then of course you're going to feel a bit more of a social responsibility to make sure that things are good and make sure things are right. You know, it's fascinating seeing the behaviors of users as well. So keeping people engaged with the product is really, really important. And maybe you don't work on a product that's particularly achievable in, but there is always a way to kind of bring the system to life, even in a kind of B2B space, for example. And there's always a way to bring metrics up to the forefront to make sure that people are aware that they're working on a living and breathing system. And I know this sounds very abstract and disconnected from sustainable cloud practices, but I really do believe that getting these foundations right will help you to build in the cloud sustainably, purely through natural intuition of your people thinking that they need to do a good job. And cost control, you know, this is always one of the things that gets mentioned when you start to talk about digital transformations and migrations from on-prem to cloud. How much is it going to cost? That there are tools available, you know, the total cost of ownership tools, for example, in AWS, you know, fantastic tools that can help you set things out when you know kind of what you're going to do with the migration. But once that migration is done, You know, you might have things like budgets in place, 100% do use those. However, you're going to grow, and you're going to grow fast naturally. And that's what you wanted to do, right? You wanted to be able to grow fast and innovate, etc., and unleash the power of the amazing public cloud. One of the really big things that I would definitely advocate when you move into this kind of space, you know, and again, you might be an individual with many hats on, and one of those hats will be finance. If you're working in a larger organization, you'll without doubt have a finance or procurement function that are involved in this. And what I mentioned earlier about bringing those sort of, you know, outside of technology, traditional roles, such as project management and finance, etc., into the space of being educated about how the cloud works. You know, there are so many, you know, short and very useful courses that are available online, that, you know, you can get these people to do, and they will probably love it because they'll learn something they didn't know before, and it will really help you because it will help you to stop having to, you know, talk about the technical things in a completely different language to those people that are traditionally non-technical. But it works both ways, and it does mean that I would strongly encourage that the technology organizations, whether they're leaders or you know, engineers themselves, to learn about the finance aspect of it. And again, there are so many kind of easy to read and easy to access resources available from the public cloud providers about how best to finance things. But when it comes down to it, if you learn about that, you know, if I was completely new to technology and I'd learned about, you know, VMs, etc., and I'd learned that EC2 in the example of AWS was a, you know, a way to run my workloads, I'd probably just go for it, right? I'd probably just provision a load of on-demand EC2 instances and away we go. And that does happen. But if you start to think about the fact that you could have done RIs, okay, that might be a simple fix. You know, once you know how large your workload is and how it needs to scale, you can invest quite comfortably in RIs, whether they're, you know, short term or longer term. But, you know, when it comes down to things like Spot, for example, where you, in the example of AWS specifically, where you would have designed your application to be, you know, not able to use Spot before, you start to think, well, I could have done things differently. I could have maybe created this so that it was something that could survive an interruption at any given time, you know, and make it stateless in that way. Or you could even start to think about how you go serverless, right? I mean, that's for me a very big kind of wave that's now coming in, is this kind of push towards serverless architectures, which sounds like an amazing thing. And I'm sure we're going to see more and more workloads achieved in a serverless fashion, purely because of the ease and the costs. But bringing, you know, those aspects into it, it starts to morph the inputs, right, from architectural perspectives and how these things are designed. And that's why, you know, wrapping it up, you know, into that culture and bringing people along the entire journey is really, really important for that sustainable build. If you start to achieve those cost savings through the way you design your applications, as opposed to just taking advantage of the fact that you don't need to run a data center, you don't need to manage that data center, and you can take advantage of all the great things that AWS does. If you can go, or any other public cloud provider does, if you want to go beyond that, you need to start bringing everybody along on that journey with you. And that's why I kind of say spend a little to save a lot, create a technical and financial sandbox to work in for innovation. You don't want to suffocate people from being able to innovate and being able to use those tools. And you certainly don't want to stop the cloud being what it possibly could be for you and your company if you do allow innovation. So innovation can be amazing, so let it be. And I think that allocating, you know, practically, when it comes down to allocating some budget to allow for that is really, really important. Allocating some time in their space, you know, whether it be a Friday afternoon or something like that every couple of weeks to do a hackathon, or even just let people go off on their own kind of tangents and doing their own things. You know, it's really important to give people that space to think about how to do things. We don't want to go too far towards control. So kind of giving that kind of sense that people have got the freedom to do what they want on occasion is really important, but make sure that is obviously, as I say, sandboxed in a way. And be prepared to spend time and energy on it. The results will be exponentially rewarding. And when you build new things, always operate in this new culture outlook that you've kind of developed and fostered. You know, you can take experience from previous projects and perhaps start to kind of think about where you went wrong or what went well, you know, in the traditional kind of retrospective framework, but making sure that anything new you do, whether you're in a startup or whether you're in a larger organization, I would strongly encourage you to operate with this kind of cultural outlook in mind, and how things will grow, and how you can bring those different roles along the journey with you, and how you can avoid creating that kind of the picture of the nuts and bolts all over the place, and creating this sort of disparate organization that all wants different things. If you start to move forward in the right way, you can build sustainably in the cloud, and you know, in theory, if you continue on that way, you'll certainly see a road to success. So that's it. And my last note was make it fun. We're here to work, obviously, and we're here to build, but if it's no fun, then it's no good, because people will slowly lose the attraction to that culture. So making sure that you give people that time and space to kind of enjoy what they're doing, and enjoy building in the cloud, and enjoy discovering new things in that sandbox way is really critical to making sure that that sustainable movement pushes forward.
Thanks, Elliott. That's great. It's really interesting points there. We do have a couple of questions, if you don't mind. First one is, do you agree that all the big cloud providers have very different styles, and the systems really need to match those styles to be used in those clouds?
To an extent, yes. I think that, you know, in my particular experience, GCP, for example, I think is very tailored towards developers and software engineers. And AWS is more kind of tailored towards traditional infrastructure elements when it comes down to the basics, I think. I do think that there are certainly different ways that those public clouds need to be implemented to achieve the kind of the sustainable development and the reliable development. Yes, I do agree with that. Do I think that the fundamental principles apply universally? Yes, I do. I think that there are certainly pros and cons to using different public cloud providers, and certain workloads will match a GCP or an Azure better than they would an AWS or an Oracle or whoever it might be. But I think from the cultural aspect, I think it applies pretty universally. And I also, as I said, kind of at the top, I don't even think that this is necessarily this cultural kind of element is necessarily something that's specifically associated to public cloud. It could even apply to, you know, on-premise or private cloud if that's the way you want it to go.
Thank you. There's one or two more. Another one is, what's the best way to win over senior leadership / decision makers and get time allocated to focus on best practices?
As I say, I think that's the most, in my experience, the biggest thing that we did when it came to winning over senior leadership, both technology leadership who were under pressure to obviously deliver, and also, you know, product or financial or, you know, even operating, for example, leaderships. I think the biggest thing we did was be open and honest about it. The worst thing you can do is come to the end of a project and say, look, we've got a load of stuff we needed to fix that we should have done while we were building it. I think when you first spot the signs of something going awry, I would raise it up, however tough that conversation might be. And that's where you start to sort of generate that culture. If you're reporting to a senior leader and you're not raising up the issues that your engineering teams or whoever might be in your team are raising to you, then you're just kind of building this atmosphere of, you know, sweeping things under the carpet. And even though those conversations may be tough, I would strongly urge anybody who's struggling to win people over to have them, because the proof will be in the pudding at the end of it. If you launch your project and you have very little rectifications that need to be done, you have very little issues in life that need to be resolved, then that project will be deemed a success. And if you do that a few times, it starts to become the norm. You need to build habits out of this sort of thing, having those conversations. And if they I guess if they know what's right for their organization, and they see the results of the success of you having those difficult conversations further before product launches, then they'll start to see that is the right process and practice to follow in the long term.
Okay, thanks. Just one more here. What kind of practical measures can you put in place to promote the culture of DevOps and sustainable cloud building?
Yeah. So I think that I've already talked about things like education and courses, and, you know, people can do that very easily and very quickly, often for free with some of the public cloud providers if you want to be specific. And there are obviously paid for courses. Education is very important, but it's not going to be for everyone, and not everybody is going to take their time to proactively go and educate themselves, or even take advantage of things that the business might make available to them. I'd like to think that most enterprises and organizations have these kind of central kind of meetups and meetings to kind of brief people on how the state of affairs are with the business and that technology outfit. I would strongly encourage people to, stand up and speak about these issues and bring them to the forefront of people's minds. I used to speak fairly regularly at our kind of all hands meetings, kind of make sure that we were focusing on the right things culturally. Another thing we did was literally, again, I know this is something that's a little bit more complex in the current day and age, but we put posters up around the office. We developed these kind of the concept of these pillars of reliability, and I know there are DevOps pillars as well, and just having these things in people's faces was really, really helpful, and kind of, playing on the subconscious a little bit to make sure that people were kind of coming into the office and the first thing they would see would be that kind of thing. And, people might have intranets and things like this. I would just make sure that, people in these kind of roles where you're, tasked with being an advocate of sustainable development and developing in the right way and building a technology culture are promoting via any channel they possibly can. And making sure that, people are very aware. And again, I think the other really, really key important is the important point that I made earlier was just having that data visible, the power of having the knowledge that you're working on something that, a consumer or a user or another business is taking advantage of, and that's happening, in real time is very important to making sure people are kept aware that the work they're doing is very valued, and they're doing a good job is incredibly valued by the users or the consumers.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Elliot. Look, thanks for your time and for your talk this afternoon. It's been
Thank you, everyone, for coming.
insightful. I'm sure everyone's enjoyed it. If any of you are watching and you're thinking that's something I'd like to do, then we're always looking for people to come and talk about their stories, technically, of course. So if you are interested, please do get in touch with us. But look, yeah, I'll leave it there and say thanks again, Elliot, and hope to talk to you soon and see you all again.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.